Good morning, boys and girls. Today we are going to be talking real quick about the interwar period and how kind of things went south and led to some pretty significant results that sets up Europe and the rest of the world for World War II and later events in world history. So mainly we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, if you've heard that term before. Um, but we're also going to go a little bit into some of the deeper causes, I guess, of the Great Depression and some things that were happening going on that set up the world to enter into that period. So, first, you can't talk about um, an economic crisis or the Great Depression without talking about World War One. Basically, like we talked about quickly when we talked about the effects of World War One, is that in the places where the war was actually fought, like these two cities that you see here in France, um, things are basically in ruins. They're destroyed. And so not only do we have kind of the world heading towards this economic depression and governments going into debt because they were taking out loans to help fight this war, but their infrastructure and their villages and their cities and factories and everything is basically completely destroyed. So they have no way to make up that money to pay off that debt or to start pulling themselves out of this depression. So the first kind of facet that we need to know here is that a lot of this can be traced back to World War One. Even though typically wars are good for an economy, we'll see World War Two actually pulls the world out of the Great Depression. Sometimes they can the longer term effects after they're over can work the opposite way. So factor number one is that basically World War One comes along and destroys parts of Europe that make it, when the Great Depression comes along, make it that much worse. Now, when we talk about some of the causes and just list the causes, um, there's like seven or eight of them. So we don't need to know a ton of these in a lot of debt. There's a couple that I will point out, but basically, you've got debt from World War One, like we talked about just on that previous slide. The second one is that countries start to, when things start to take a turn south, they start to kind of protect their own industries by instituting tariffs on imported goods, meaning we're going to tax things that are being imported from another country. That way, we're encouraging our people to buy the cheaper goods produced in our own country. And that way, what we're doing is we're kind of investing and building up our own industry and our own economy rather than buying goods from other places and building up their economy. The result of that, though, is that typically when you have less or smaller amounts of trade worldwide, that's not a good thing for the global economy. You want money being spent and changing hands and taxes paid and all that kind of stuff for a healthy, robust economy, and that's not really happening when you're instituting a bunch of tariffs on imported goods. The third cause is that after the war, economies kind of struggled to shift back to a peacetime economy. We don't have the same demand for goods and materials, and so what we're left with is basically a bunch of stuff that's been produced for a certain price, and then when the demand for that stuff goes away, the price goes down. So we paid maybe $10 to produce something, but now we can only sell that something for $6. And if you multiply that by millions and billions of dollars on a global economic scale, we're talking humongous losses. So the slow reaction to kind of shifting back to a peacetime economy could be considered another cause. One of the major ones, and one that we need to know, is this number four, depreciated currencies. And depreciated is just a fancy word for the currencies get less valuable. The most famous example of this is in Germany after World War One. So if you remember, after World War One, the Treaty of Versailles, France basically punishes Germany as much as they possibly can. And that leads to Germany having to pay off something like 132 billion marks in reparations. And so the problems or the roots of this hyperinflation in Germany go back to kind of how Germany thought they were going to pay off the war. When war breaks out, Germany thinks they're going to win, obviously. So they take out a bunch of loans, and they're going to finance the war using those loans, thinking they're going to win and then force the losing parties to pay off their loans. So when they don't win, and instead of getting a bunch of money, they have to pay a bunch of money in the Treaty of Versailles, things go south quickly. Um, if you can see the table here that I kind of really quickly put together, the exchange rate for a German mark and US dollar, you can kind of track the inflation in Germany, because what they do to try to pay off that debt is basically they print more money. And whenever you print more money, that's not a good economic solution to being in debt. That just means that each individual piece of money becomes less valuable. So if you look in 1919, basically, if you took $1 into Germany, you could get about 4 marks for that dollar. Late 1919, so a little bit later that same year, you took that same dollar into Germany, you can get 48 marks for that dollar. So literally just within a year, we're talking humongous inflation. But then if you fast forward to the end of 1923, you take that same dollar into Germany, the German mark has become so worthless that you can actually get, I don't even know, that's a big number, 4,210,500,000,000 marks for that one US dollar. So basically, the German mark becomes incredibly worthless. And so what we see is we get some of these. Oh, we're not there yet. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Here's an image of a mark that was printed in 1923, and it was a mark for 50 trillion marks. German money is so worthless that they're having to print literally like bills, like we would think of $100 bill or a $50 bill, but they're printing them in 50 trillion units because that's how worthless money was. And it was so worthless that we get some of these really famous pictures of things that people were doing with their money rather than spending it as money, because it's basically worthless. So you got here, this guy is wallpapering his house with German marks because it was actually cheaper to do that than to use the marks to buy the wallpaper. This woman here made a dress for herself out of German marks. These kids made the German marks into a kite that they're flying. You can see down here in the bottom corner, this little boy is cutting up German marks just like a piece of paper for arts and crafts time at his house, and his sister's gluing something to the mark. So they're just basically using it as paper. Here we've got bundles of German mark money being used as like building blocks for kids. And this is probably the most famous one. This woman is basically shoving a bunch of German marks into her stove to help heat her house, because instead of going to the store and buying firewood with the German marks, it's actually more efficient, more valuable as firewood itself. So when we talk about the beginnings of the Great Depression, Germany is already in a place where their money is basically valueless. And so when the Great Depression comes along, it's just going to exacerbate this and make it that much worse. The fifth cause is that basically old trade patterns kind of got disrupted by the war. You have people fighting and friends now that weren't fighting or weren't friends before. And when you kind of shift some of those things, sometimes changes can be good, but when you're planning on trading with a specific nation and you produce the things to sell to that nation, and then all of a sudden you're not going to be able to sell them, that's just going to make the overproduction problem even worse. And then the last one, probably one of the larger ones, again, one we need to know, is so-called speculation in the stock market. And so that's a big fancy term, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know 100% all that that entails. But for our purposes, when we think of speculation, think of it as people are like taking out loans in order to buy stocks. Because when they think about the stock market in this period, which is the roaring 20s, where things are good and things are going well in the United States, they're assuming that they can always sell those stocks for a profit. So it's okay if I take out $100 loan and buy $100 worth of stock, because I can then theoretically always sell that stock for $150 or $200 and then pay off that loan. The problem comes when, if we're not speculating, or if we are speculating and all of a sudden we take out that $100 loan and we buy $100 worth of stock, and then the stock market goes down. And if we can only sell that stock for $75, we can't pay that loan back. And so that's where the stock market crash starts to really hurt people, is because they're not spending money that they have to buy stocks. Instead, they're spending money that they're borrowing to buy stocks. And so when they can't pay them back, they go bankrupt, people make runs on banks, and we get what we know of as the Great Depression. So by 1929, stock prices had reached basically the highest they'd ever been. The average stock price on the Dow Jones had reached $381 in 1929. That was up from like $63 in 1921. But slowly, different economies around the world began to stall. And basically, the stock market it didn't have the protections that are in place today. And again, I'm not an economist, so I don't know 100% what all of that means. But basically, before October of 1929, there were signs. The stock market was dropping really quick and then recovering really quickly. It was just really volatile, really big swings, good and bad. And so people start to get antsy until what happens, or until what's known as Black Monday. On October 28th, 1929, the Dow drops like 13% in one day, which is a humongous drop. And then the next day, it drops another 12%. And if you fast forward to 1932, it drops a total of 89% below that $381 that was back in 1929. So what we're saying is there were all of these underlying causes: overproduction and disrupted trade patterns and speculation and depreciation of currency. But then in 1929, the end of 1929, the stock market just basically plummets. And that's the kind of the spark that sets everything off and sets the Great Depression into motion. Now, it's not like countries and nations around Europe just kind of sat still and did what they, just twiddled their thumbs and said, it is what it is. There were different responses that these nations tried to help alleviate some of this suffering and some of the things that were going on with the Great Depression. One of them is this guy, John Maynard Keynes, in Great Britain. He develops a new kind of economic theory. And basically what he's arguing against the old classical economics, where he says basically economists throughout history had argued that the market is cyclical. It's going to go down and then it's going to go back up, and it's going to basically correct itself. And he's going to say, no, it might do that eventually, but if we do nothing, we're actually helping make things worse. And so what he argues is that the government should step in and undertake what they call deficit spending, where the government is going into debt in order to create jobs and alleviate some of the concerns and worries. Because really his argument is, if the government does nothing and the government increases taxes and cuts spending to try to make their ends meet, they're sending the message to the people that the people should do the same thing. And if the people stopped spending money and they stopped buying things and selling things, then all of a sudden we're making that economy worse, because money isn't changing hands and taxes aren't getting paid and so on and so on. So what he says is that the government should actually, and it sounds counterintuitive, but the government should actually spend more money when they don't have it. And in doing so, send the message to their people that, hey, we're going to take care of you. You're going to have money. Make sure you're still buying things and selling things and going to work and feeding your family. But what ends up happening, the British government doesn't really listen to him. They cut taxes. They decrease their own spending, and we see the Great Depression happen. Kind of going along with that, Great Britain tries this thing called what's now known as a national government. Basically, when we talk about a national government, they're trying to, and again, not an economist, I'm sorry, but they're trying to maintain the value of their currency. They don't want a Germany situation where people are wallpapering their houses with money, but you still want to do things that help your country get out of this depression. And so what they did was they created a national government led by this guy, Ramsay MacDonald, where basically they're trying to balance the budget and restore confidence in the population. They call it a national government because he actually takes a group of people from all of the major political parties and puts them in his cabinet. So it's almost like an alliance between all of the different political parties, where they realize there's this big Great Depression going on. We have to put some of our smaller differences aside in order to get our country through this thing. And so he has representatives from the Labor Party. He has conservatives, liberals. And so they basically get together in order to balance the budget. They cut government expenditures, and that's where John Maynard Keynes steps in and says, "Whoa, time out! You're sending the wrong message." They don't necessarily listen to Keynes. Keynes gains a little bit of a following, but in Britain, basically, they're cutting spending, trying to balance their own budget, and it doesn't necessarily help Britain get out of that Great Depression. Likewise, in France, we have a different kind of political coalition called the Popular Front. And so, similar idea, they're going to take a bunch of the left wing political parties like communists, socialists, things like that, and they get together, basically say, we're going to work together to try to win some rights for the workers, help the workers and the lower classes through this Great Depression, since they're the ones that are hit the hardest by it. And so they introduce a lot of protections for workers, like workers now have the right to strike. Everybody in France gets 2 weeks of paid vacation leave. They limit the work week to 40 hours, wages raise. And while the workers are getting all of these things, that's good and great. And yeah, they can make it work. Good for them. But the problem is that doesn't just come out of nowhere. You can't just pay people for vacation with money that's sitting around, because if they had that money, they would have been doing that kind of thing. And so what ends up happening is that, yeah, we see wages increase by 48%, but then prices rose by 46%. And also the French industry began to kind of struggle, because when you're used to, or when you're counting on, and your system is set up to have people work for 50 hours or 60 hours or 70 hours a week, and now all of a sudden they can only work 40 hours, you're producing less, which means prices are going to rise. Foreign products are going to start to become more competitive in your country. And so, especially in France, as they're trying to recover, think back to those destroyed villages that we looked at earlier, as they're trying to recover from the destruction of World War One, this is not necessarily the best way to pull France out of that depression. And so, yes, workers win some rights, win some protections. It's not necessarily the best for French industry. And we're going to kind of leave it here. But basically, what we need to know is that when things get bad, when the economy gets bad, when you don't know if your family is going to have a meal, people become more and more willing to go to the extremes and put their trust in these kind of extremist politicians, if those politicians say that they can fix whatever the problem is. So when they're wallpapering their house with German marks, and kids are playing with bundles of money because it's literally worthless and you don't know if your family's going to eat, a guy named Hitler comes along and says, hey, you know what? It's not your fault. It's this other group's fault. And I can fix it. And here's how. That's how he gets elected into office. He doesn't take over. He doesn't have a coup. He doesn't overthrow the government. He's elected. And the Nazi Party is elected into the German Reichstag. And so where we're going to leave it today, and we'll pick up tomorrow, is that kind of the Great Depression, this global economic crisis that's made worse by World War One, that's made worse by this economic depreciation. The end kind of major result of that is that in places like Germany and Italy and Spain and Russia, people are more willing to turn to extremist governments. And we see some brand new democracies that had been created after World War One kind of falter and fail in turn for a strong authoritarian government that says that they can fix things. So shoot me a text on Remind if you need anything, if you have any questions. Hope everything's going well, and I will talk to you guys later.